This video will show you how to disassemble a 10-inch truss tube Ritchey Chretien telescope to replace the fans, or to get inside for any reason. But since the small fans used on these scopes are the most likely point of failure, I also took the opportunity to move the fans to the outside of the scope to make it easier in the future. I purchased the scope from Ioptron, and within a year one of the fans had failed. Ioptron sent me a new set of fans, but they never sent me instructions on how to replace them. And I couldn't find any on YouTube videos that were showing this, so I thought I'd create one of my own and post it here. My first step was to remove the filter material that I added to the rear slots and the fan openings. I did this to reduce dust infiltration and to keep bugs out of the scope. It was just attached with Velcro hook strips, so it came off pretty easily. Next, I removed the focuser and I stood the scope up on end to get a better working position. The Losmandy dovetail bars were mounted to the front and rear plates, so those had to be removed first. The next step is to remove the 8 screws that hold the rear plate to the truss tube mounts. I also marked the rear plate and one of the truss mounts with a piece of blue painter's tape so I would be sure to reassemble in the same orientation. Might not be completely necessary, but I figured if I reassemble it in the original orientation, the collimation would hopefully not be too far off. Once the screws were removed, the rear plate could be lifted off along with the attached mirror assembly. Looking it over, I could see that the collimation screws were the only thing holding the mirror assembly to the rear plate. The larger pull screws were threaded into the mirror assembly to pull it backwards towards the plate. The smaller push screws provided a stop position for the mirror assembly when the pull screws were tightened. So it was the smaller push screws which set the position for collimation. If I didn't touch those screws, the collimation should be pretty close when I reassembled it. Again, at this point, I used some painter's tape to mark the orientation of the mirror assembly so that when I put it back together with the back plate, it would be in the same orientation. I then removed the 3 larger collimation screws and their springs, and I set the mirror assembly aside. I rested it upside down on the baffle tube so that the mirror would not be exposed to any potential drop tools or dust or dirt falling on it. Now I had access to the fans that were bolted to the inside of the back plate. The 3 new fans came as an assembly pre-wired to the single 12-volt power jack. The old fans were easily removed just by removing the screws from the back plate that held the fans on and the screws that held the power jack on. threaded holes for the fans went completely through the back plate, so it was pretty easy to install the new fans on the outside instead of the inside. But I had also purchased separately some filters designed to attach to a fan of this size, so I had to use longer 3mm screws to put them onto the back plate because the filters added more thickness than the original screws could accommodate. I then used some self-adhesive cable clips to route the fan wiring around the focuser mount, being careful to leave them clear of all of the collimation screws. I didn't bother mounting the power jack to anything solid. I just used some electrical tape to cover the exposed lugs on the rear side, and I used a few small zip ties to bring the 3 fan cables together into a bundle. Then I clipped that bundle into the cable management device that I had attached to the focuser mount. It's that red thing you can see with the fingers on it that allows you to slip wires in between them. And then I just let the jack hang, and I would plug the power into that when mounted on the mount. Once the wiring was all in place, I plugged it into a 12-volt supply and tested the fans before further assembly. The last step before reassembly was to apply the filter material back onto the openings on the back of the backplate. Since the fans had their own filters now, I no longer needed to cover those openings, so I cut smaller strips to cover the slots, making sure to leave the collimation screws exposed. At this point, it was just the reverse process from the disassembly. The only part that was a little tricky was lining up the springs and the collimation screws. There's nothing to hold the springs in place, so I just set them on the rear surface of the mirror assembly. I slid the collimation pull screws into the holes on the rear plate, and then I carefully lowered the rear plate onto the mirror assembly, trying to get the screws aligned into the springs and into the threaded holes on the mirror assembly. It took a little fiddling, but wasn't too bad. Then I tightened up the collimation pull screws until the push screws contacted the mirror assembly. Before putting the assembly back into the scope, I took a look at the mirror. It did have some dust on it, so I tried to clean it off with some canned air, but it didn't budge. That's usually the case if the dust is made mostly of sticky pollen. It tends to adhere to the mirror. I probably wouldn't have bothered to clean this mirror if it was still in the scope, but since I had easy access to it, I thought it made sense to clean the pollen off at this point. I used an optic cleaning solution made primarily from isopropyl alcohol and distilled water, and used some cotton swabs to gently clean a small area at a time. I wiped off the excess with Kim wipes. The mirror in this scope has a dielectric coating, so I wasn't too concerned about damaging it, but I was still very careful and just used minimal pressure. For any leftover streaks, I breathed on the mirror, which basically applies distilled water, and then wiped the condensation off with the Kim wipes. Once the mirror looked good, I replaced the rear assembly on the scope body and screwed it back onto the truss mounts. The final step was to just reinstall the Losmandy dovetail rails. I hope this helps others who might need to disassemble their scope and give them some tips on how to do it.